I can tell you the exact moment I stopped believing in the honesty of American sports, American politics, and the American dream itself. October 1st, 1919. Game 1 of the World Series. I was 17 years old, still green enough to think the world worked the way my parents said it did. That hard work got you somewhere. That the system was basically fair. That men in positions of power could be trusted to do the right thing. I was working for a bookmaker named Solomon Solly Finkelstein, operating out of a 3-room apartment above a butcher shop on Delancey Street in Manhattan's Lower East Side. My job was simple. I was a runner. I took bets, recorded them in a ledger, delivered payouts when customers won, and kept my mouth shut when the cops came sniffing around. Solly paid me $5 a week, plus a small percentage of the action I brought in. It wasn't much, but in 1919, for a kid whose father had died in a factory accident and whose mother took in laundry to keep food on the table, $5 might as well have been 50. The World Series that year was between the Chicago White Sox and the Cincinnati Reds. The White Sox were heavy favorites, and I mean heavy. They had one of the best teams in baseball history. Shoeless Joe Jackson hitting over .350, Eddie Sickott with a 29-win season, a lineup that could punish any pitcher, a rotation that shut down opposing offenses. The smart money, the confident money, the money that came from guys who actually understood baseball was all on Chicago. But starting about 3 days before Game 1, something strange started happening. Big money, serious, suitcase full of cash money, started pouring in on Cincinnati. Not from regular gamblers. Not from neighborhood guys betting their paycheck. This was money from men in tailored suits who pulled up in expensive cars, who didn't haggle over odds, who laid down $5,000, $10,000, sometimes $20,000 at a time without blinking. Solly noticed. I noticed. Every bookmaker in New York noticed. Something's wrong, Solly muttered on the morning of Game 1, staring at his ledger like it had personally insulted him. This doesn't make sense. Why would anyone with half a brain put this kind of money on Cincinnati? I didn't have an answer. I was 17. I knew how to take a bet and run an errand, but I didn't understand the deeper mechanics of what was happening. Then Game 1 started. Eddie Sickott, the White Sox ace, walked out to the mound. First batter, he hit him with a pitch. Second batter, wild pitch. By the end of the first inning, Cincinnati had scored a run, and Sickott looked like he'd forgotten how to pitch. The game got worse from there. Errors, misplays, guys swinging at pitches they should have laid off. By the time Cincinnati won, 9-1, even I, who barely knew baseball beyond what the betting slips told me, could tell something was off. Solly, though, he knew immediately. That night, after we'd closed up and paid out the Cincinnati bettors, he pulled me into the back room, locked the door, and lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "Kid," he said, voice low, "that game was fixed." I laughed. I actually laughed. "Come on, Solly. The World Series? Nobody can fix the World Series." He didn't laugh. He just stared at me with tired, sad eyes. "Arnold Rothstein fixed it," he said. At the time, I barely knew who Arnold Rothstein was. I'd heard the name. Everyone in the gambling world had, but I didn't understand what it meant. I didn't know that I was watching the birth of something new, something that would change organized crime, American sports, and the entire relationship between money and power. Over the next 8 days, as the World Series played out and Cincinnati improbably beat the mighty White Sox, I started paying attention, and I started asking questions. By the end of October 1919, I knew 3 things for certain. 1. The Chicago White Sox had thrown the World Series. 2. Arnold Rothstein had orchestrated the whole thing. 3. The world I thought I understood, where rules mattered, where fairness existed, where institutions could be trusted, was a lie. That realization changed my life. And Arnold Rothstein, a man I wouldn't meet face to face for another 2 years, became the most important figure in my understanding of how power actually worked in America. My name is Nathan Goldstein. I worked in and around organized crime from 1919 until 1938, when I finally got out and moved to California to start over. I'm 93 years old now, and most of the people from those days are long dead. But I remember Arnold Rothstein like I saw him yesterday. This is his story. and mine, and the story of how one genius criminal invented the modern underworld. Part 1. The son who disappointed his father. Arnold Rothstein was born on January 17, 1882, in a respectable brownstone on East 47th Street in Manhattan, into a world that should have led him to rabbinical study, legitimate business, and a quiet, honorable life. His father, Abraham Rothstein, was everything you'd want in a patriarch. Successful garment manufacturer, pillar of the Jewish community, deeply religious, charitable, well regarded by Gentiles and Jews alike. People called him Abe the Just because of his reputation for fairness and honesty. He was the kind of man other men pointed to and said, "That's how you live a good life." Arnold's older brother, Harry, followed in those footsteps. Studious, respectful, obedient. He went to Columbia University, became a lawyer, married well, did everything right. Arnold, from the beginning, was different. Even as a child, he was smarter than everyone around him. Not in a book-learning way, though he was perfectly capable of that when he felt like it. Arnold was smart in the way a chess grandmaster is smart. He saw patterns, calculated outcomes, understood human behavior at a level most people never reach. But he was also drawn to the forbidden. While Harry studied Talmud, Arnold snuck out to watch dice games in alleyways. While his father prayed, Arnold learned card tricks from street hustlers. By the time he was 14, he was gambling for money, winning more often than he lost, and realizing something crucial. The world rewarded intelligence, but it rewarded ruthless, focused intelligence even more. His father tried everything. Lectures, punishments, appeals to religious duty. Nothing worked. Arnold didn't rebel out of anger or teenage defiance. He simply found the world his father represented. Honest work, modest profits, ethical behavior. Boring. Why should I spend my life working like a dog for pennies? Arnold once asked his father, when I can use my brain to make real money. Abraham Rothstein was heartbroken. He'd given his son every advantage, and the son had chosen criminality. By the time Arnold was 20, the rupture was complete. He moved out, stopped attending synagogue, stopped pretending he cared about his father's approval. Abraham would live until 1939, long enough to see his younger son become one of the most notorious criminals in America, and the disappointment never faded. But Arnold didn't care. He'd made his choice. Part 2. The Professional Gambler. In his early 20s, Arnold Rothstein became a professional gambler, and not the degenerate kind. He approached gambling the way a mathematician approaches a problem, with discipline, calculation, and a deep understanding of probability. He started with card games, poker, mostly, playing in backrooms, saloons, anywhere money changed hands. He had an extraordinary memory, able to track every card played, calculate odds in real time, and read opponents' tells with eerie accuracy. But Arnold understood something most gamblers didn't. The house always wins in the long run, so the smartest move is to be the house. By 1904, at age 22, Arnold had enough money to open his own gambling establishment on West 46th Street. It wasn't a seedy backroom operation. It was upscale, elegant, with good liquor, attractive women, and games that were, mostly, honest. That last part was crucial. Arnold could have rigged every game and made quick money, but he was playing a longer game. He wanted repeat customers. He wanted businessmen, politicians, celebrities to feel comfortable gambling there. So he kept the games clean enough to maintain his reputation, but he controlled the odds, the environment, the flow of money, and he made sure the right people were protected. Arnold cultivated relationships with police officers, judges, Tammany Hall politicians. He contributed to campaigns. He provided loans to men in power. He made himself useful, indispensable even, so that when problems arose, those problems quietly disappeared. By 1910, Arnold Rothstein was wealthy, well-connected, and operating with near impunity. He wasn't just a gambler. He was a fixer, the man you went to when you needed something done, something arranged, something made to go away. That reputation would serve him well when the biggest opportunity of his life came along. Part 3. The Scandal That Shook America. The 1919 World Series fix is one of the most famous scandals in American sports history, But most people don't understand how it actually happened. They think it was a simple bribery scheme. Some gamblers paid some players, the players threw some games, and a story. The reality was far more complex, and Arnold Rothstein was at the center of it. It started in September 1919, about 2 weeks before the World Series. A former boxer and small-time gambler named Joseph Sport Sullivan approached Arnold with an idea. "What if," Sullivan said, "we could convince the White Sox to throw the series?" Most people would have dismissed it as fantasy. The logistics alone seemed impossible. You need multiple players. One or two wouldn't be enough to guarantee the outcome. You need serious money to make the bribes worthwhile. You need absolute secrecy, because if word leaked before the series even started, the whole thing would collapse. Arnold didn't dismiss it. He asked questions. How many players would it take? Who were the targets? How much money? How would the payoffs work? Who else was involved? Sullivan had some answers. There was already talk among certain White Sox players about throwing games. The team's owner, Charles Comiskey, was notoriously cheap, paying his stars far less than they were worth. Several players, Eddie Sicott, Chick Gandil, Shoeless Joe Jackson, among others, were angry, resentful, open to making money outside the system. Arnold listened, calculated, and saw the opportunity. But he was too smart to put his fingerprints directly on the operation. Instead, he worked through intermediaries. He provided some of the money. How much, exactly, has never been definitively proven, but estimates range from $80,000 to $100,000. He connected Sullivan with other gamblers and financiers who could contribute. He arranged for the betting to be spread across multiple cities to avoid detection. And then he placed his own bets. Huge bets. On Cincinnati. Part 4. 8 men out. 8 Chicago White Sox players agreed to participate in the fix. Eddie Sicott, the ace pitcher. Shoeless Joe Jackson, one of the best hitters in baseball. Chick Gandil, the first baseman and ringleader. Lefty Williams, another starting pitcher. Swede Risberg, the shortstop. Fred McMullen, a utility player. Happy Felsch, the center fielder. Buck Weaver, the third baseman. Though Weaver's involvement is disputed, he knew about the fix but may not have participated. The payoffs were supposed to total $100,000, split among the players. In practice, not all of them got what they were promised. Some were paid in full, others got partial payments, and some, like Joe Jackson, later claimed they never received the money at all or tried to return it. But enough money changed hands to make the fix operational. Game 1, October 1st, 1919. Eddie Sicott takes the mound and immediately signals the fix is on by hitting the first batter. The White Sox lose 9-1. Game 2. Lefty Williams pitches poorly. Cincinnati wins again, 4-2. Game 3. A young White Sox pitcher not involved in the fix, Dickie Kerr, wins 3-0, briefly throwing the plan into chaos. Game 4. Sicott pitches again, makes critical errors. Cincinnati wins 2-0. Game 5. Lefty Williams gets shelled. Cincinnati wins 5-0. At this point, Cincinnati leads the series 4-1 in a best-of-9 format. The gamblers who'd bet on Cincinnati are ecstatic. Arnold Rothstein is already counting his profits. But then something unexpected happens. Some of the White Sox players, either out of guilt or because they hadn't been paid in full, start trying to win. Game 6. Dickie Kerr wins again, 5-4. Game 7. Sicott, perhaps trying to salvage his conscience, pitches a strong game. White Sox win, 4-1. Game 8. Lefty Williams, reportedly threatened with violence if he doesn't cooperate, gives up 4 runs in the first inning. Cincinnati wins, 10-5, and takes the World Series. Arnold Rothstein, by conservative estimates, cleared $350,000 from the fix, about $5.5 million in today's money. Other gamblers connected to the scheme made similar fortunes. For a while, nobody knew. The rumors circulated, but without proof, they remained whispers. Then, in September 1920, a grand jury investigation began. Part 5, the trial that went nowhere. When the Black Sox scandal broke publicly in 1920, it was a national crisis. Americans' faith in baseball, in sports, in institutions, in fairness itself, was shattered. 8 White Sox players were indicted for conspiracy to commit fraud. Gamblers and fixers were investigated. And Arnold Rothstein's name came up repeatedly. He was called to testify before the grand jury. Arnold walked into that room impeccably dressed, calm, polite, and absolutely prepared. He had the best lawyers money could buy. He had carefully constructed alibis. And most importantly, he had friends in powerful positions who owed him favors. He admitted he'd heard rumors about a fix. He denied any involvement. He claimed he'd actually warned people that the series might be crooked and advised them not to bet on it. A claim that was laughable to anyone who knew the truth, but impossible to disprove. The grand jury had no hard evidence connecting Arnold to the payoffs. The players who'd been bribed weren't going to admit who paid them. The intermediaries kept their mouths shut. Arnold Rothstein walked away untouched. The 8 players weren't so lucky. They were banned from professional baseball for life, their careers destroyed, their reputations ruined. Shoeless Joe Jackson, one of the greatest hitters in baseball history, spent the rest of his life trying to clear his name and was never reinstated. Arnold, meanwhile, became more powerful than ever. His reputation as the man who fixed the World Series spread through the underworld. He wasn't feared for violence. Arnold rarely used violence himself. He was feared because he could do the impossible. He could corrupt systems that were supposed to be incorruptible, and that made him invaluable. Part 6, Prohibition and the Birth of an Empire. On January 17, 1920, Arnold Rothstein's 38th birthday, the Volstead Act took effect, making the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol illegal across the United States. For Arnold, it was the greatest birthday present he could have imagined. Prohibition didn't eliminate demand for alcohol. It just criminalized supply, which meant enormous profit opportunities for anyone smart enough and organized enough to meet that demand. Within weeks, Arnold was organizing bootlegging operations. But he didn't do it the way most criminals did. Hijacking trucks, bribing cops on a case-by-case basis, operating by the seat of their pants. Arnold treated bootlegging like a corporation. He financed shipments from Canada, Europe, and the Caribbean. He arranged for warehouses, transportation networks, distribution channels. He bribed entire police precincts, judges, and politicians wholesale, creating systematic protection rather than ad hoc payoffs. And most importantly, he taught a new generation of mobsters how to think strategically. Part 7. The Students. In the early 1920s, several young gangsters came into Arnold Rothstein's orbit. They would go on to become the most powerful organized crime figures in American history, and every single one of them learned from Arnold. Charles Lucky Luciano was a young Italian gangster with ambition and brains, but no real sophistication. Arnold taught him to think beyond street-level extortion and violence. He showed Lucky that the old Mafia model, territorial warfare, ethnic divisions, rigid hierarchies, was outdated and inefficient. What worked better, Arnold explained, was cooperation. Different ethnic groups working together. Different operations coordinating instead of competing. Crime run like a business, with planning, organization, and long-term thinking. Those lessons would lead directly to Lucky's creation of the Commission in 1931, the governing body that revolutionized organized crime. Meyer Lansky was a young Jewish gangster with a gift for numbers. Arnold recognized his talent immediately and became his mentor. He taught Meyer about money laundering, about using legitimate businesses to hide criminal profits, about offshore banking and financial structures that could insulate him from prosecution. Everything Meyer later did, the casinos in Havana and Las Vegas, the Swiss bank accounts, the international money laundering networks, had roots in methods Arnold Rothstein pioneered. Frank Costello was drawn to politics and influence. Arnold showed him how to cultivate relationships with politicians, how to make yourself indispensable, how to trade favors and build networks of corruption that protected criminal operations. Costello would later become known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld, the mob boss who controlled New York politics for decades. He learned that role from Arnold. Bugsy Siegel, Waxy Gordon, Dutch Schultz, Legs Diamond, all of them passed through Arnold's orbit, learned from him, borrowed money from him, sought his advice. Arnold Rothstein didn't just build his own criminal empire. He trained the generation that would dominate organized crime for the next 50 years. Part 8. The Drug Pioneer. While bootlegging made Arnold rich, it was narcotics that established him as a true visionary. In the early 1920s, drug trafficking was small-scale, disorganized, mostly local. Individual dealers buying from individual suppliers, selling to individual users. There was no structure, no system, no organization beyond the street level. Arnold saw the potential for something much bigger. He established connections with opium and heroin suppliers in Europe and Asia, Turkey, Lebanon, France, China. He created smuggling routes through major ports: New York, New Orleans, San Francisco. He set up distribution networks in American cities, coordinating supply with demand. And most importantly, he pioneered the financial techniques that would become standard in drug trafficking. Layered transactions to obscure the money's origin, shell companies to provide legal cover, cash-intensive businesses, laundries, restaurants, nightclubs that could absorb and explain large amounts of unexplained income. Arnold never touched the drugs himself, never met with street-level dealers, never had product in his possession. He stayed several layers removed, providing financing and organization while insulating himself from direct legal exposure. It was a model that would be copied by every major drug trafficker who came after him. By the mid-1920s, Arnold Rothstein was moving enormous quantities of heroin into the United States. The profits dwarfed even bootlegging. And the techniques he developed, the financial structures, the smuggling routes, the organizational methods, would shape the international drug trade for the next century. Part 9. The Political Machine. Arnold Rothstein understood that criminal operations could only survive with political protection. So he made his life's work to own the people who mattered. His primary target was Tammany Hall, the Democratic political machine that controlled New York City. Tammany had been corrupt for decades, but Arnold took that corruption to a new level of sophistication. He didn't just bribe individual politicians when he needed a favor. He systematically invested in campaigns, funded candidates, arranged for union support, provided loans and gifts, and made himself so deeply embedded in the political structure that removing him would have required dismantling half the city government. Judges owed him. Police commissioners consulted him. Mayors took his calls. There's a story, probably apocryphal, but illustrative, that a newly elected judge once tried to prosecute one of Arnold's associates. Within a week, compromising photographs of the judge appeared on his desk. Nothing was said. The case was quietly dropped. The judge learned how things worked. Arnold operated from a base at Lindy's restaurant on Broadway, holding court like a medieval king. Every day, a parade of people came to see him. Gangsters seeking loans, politicians asking for contributions, entertainers looking for financing, businessmen needing problems solved. He'd sit at his usual table, impeccably dressed, sipping coffee, listening more than he talked. When he spoke, people leaned in. His word was binding. His judgment was final. One police detective later testified, Rothstein was the spider in the web. Everything touched him. Everything led back to him. And he never got his hands dirty. Part 10. The Teacher. In the mid-1920s, Lucky Luciano was still a rising gangster, working for Joe Masuria in the bloody Castellamarese war that was tearing apart the Italian Mafia in New York. He started spending time with Arnold Rothstein, asking questions, learning how to think beyond the street. Arnold taught him that violence was expensive. Wars cost money, attracted law enforcement attention, and created cycles of revenge that never ended. What worked better was cooperation, negotiation, finding ways for everyone to profit. The old bosses think like peasants, Arnold told Lucky one night at Lindy's. They fight over neighborhoods like they're still in Sicily. But this is America. Think bigger. Why fight over one neighborhood when you can organize the whole city? Why kill a rival when you can make him a partner? Those conversations planted the seeds for the commission. Arnold also taught Lucky about the importance of political protection. You can have all the guns in the world, he said, but if the government decides to come after you, guns won't save you. What saves you is having friends in the right places. What saves you is making yourself valuable to people in power. Lucky absorbed it all, and when he finally took power in 1931, after orchestrating the murders of Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, he implemented Arnold's vision, a national crime syndicate, organized like a corporation, with different families cooperating rather than competing, and with systematic political corruption protecting the whole operation. Arnold Rothstein died in 1928, 3 years before the commission was formed, but his fingerprints were all over it. Part 11. The Fatal Flaw. For all his brilliance, Arnold Rothstein had one weakness he couldn't control. He was a degenerate gambler. Not the smart, calculated gambling that made him money. This was something different, a compulsion, an addiction, a need that overrode his usual discipline. He bet on everything. Horse races, sporting events, card games, dice games. Sometimes he won huge. Sometimes he lost huge. But the amounts kept escalating. In September 1928, Arnold sat down for a high-stakes poker game at the Park Central Hotel in Manhattan. The game lasted 2 days. When it was over, Arnold had lost $320,000, roughly $5.5 million in today's money. For most people, losing that much would be catastrophic. For Arnold, it was painful but manageable. He'd made and lost fortunes before, but this time, he claimed the game was fixed. He accused the other players of cheating, and he refused to pay. This was a mistake. In Arnold's world, debts had to be paid. Refusing created enemies. And even Arnold Rothstein, with all his power and connections, wasn't invincible. The men he owed weren't street thugs. They were serious gamblers connected to serious people. They wanted their money, and they weren't going to wait forever. Part 12. November 4th, 1928. On the night of November 4th, 1928, Arnold Rothstein was at his usual table at Lindy's restaurant on Broadway. Around 10:15 p.m., he received a phone call. He spoke briefly, hung up, stood up, put on his coat, and told his associates he'd be back in a few minutes. He walked out of the restaurant, crossed Broadway, and entered the Park Central Hotel, the same hotel where he'd lost the $320,000 in the poker game. He went up to room 349. What happened next will never be fully known, because Arnold refused to say. At approximately 10:47 p.m., hotel guests heard a gunshot. A few minutes later, Arnold Rothstein emerged from service stairwell, staggering, clutching his abdomen. Blood seeped through his coat. A hotel employee called for help. A taxi driver pulled up and offered to take Arnold to the hospital. Arnold refused. He walked outside, on his 7th Avenue, as if he could somehow will himself to survive through sheer determination. Police and an ambulance arrived. They found Arnold sitting on the sidewalk, leaning against a wall, holding his stomach. "Who shot you?" a detective asked. Arnold didn't answer. "You need to tell us who did this." Arnold shook his head. "I'm not saying anything." They took him to Polyclinic Hospital. Doctors operated, but the damage was severe. The bullet had ripped through his intestines, causing massive internal bleeding and infection. For 2 days, Arnold lingered, drifting in and out of consciousness. Police detectives questioned him repeatedly. He refused to cooperate. "I won't talk about it," he said. "Get out." Even dying, Arnold Rothstein kept the code of the underworld. On November 6th, 1928, at 10:15 a.m., Arnold Rothstein died. He was 46 years old. Part 13. The Unsolved Murder. The investigation into Arnold Rothstein's murder went exactly nowhere. The prime suspect was George "Hump" McManus, a gambler who'd been involved in the poker game and was allegedly owed money by Arnold. McManus was arrested and charged with murder. But the evidence was thin. No witnesses, no murder weapon, and Arnold himself had refused to identify his killer. McManus's lawyers argued that he wasn't even at the hotel that night. They produced alibi witnesses. They attacked the credibility of the police investigation. In December 1929, more than a year after Arnold's death, George McManus was acquitted. To this day, no one knows for certain who killed Arnold Rothstein. McManus is the most likely suspect, but it's also possible someone else pulled the trigger. Some theories suggest it was a contract hit ordered by other gamblers. Some suggest it was connected to Arnold's drug operations. Some suggest it was personal revenge for some long-forgotten slight. The truth died with Arnold. Part 14. The Legacy. Arnold Rothstein's funeral was held at his father's home on West 84th Street. Abraham Rothstein, the man who'd spent his life trying to steer his son toward righteousness, presided over the service with quiet dignity and profound sadness. Hundreds of people attended. Gangsters, politicians, entertainers, businessmen. The police took photographs, adding faces to their files. The newspapers covered it extensively, noting the strange mixture of legitimate society and underworld figures mourning together. Arnold was buried in a Jewish cemetery in Queens. His gravestone is simple, unmarked by any indication of who he really was. But his influence didn't die with him. Lucky Luciano created the commission in 1931, using principles Arnold had taught him. Meyer Lansky built a financial empire using techniques Arnold pioneered. Frank Costello dominated New York politics for decades, using connections Arnold helped him establish. The drug trafficking networks Arnold created in the 1920s evolved into the international heroin trade that would plague America for the next century. The money laundering techniques he developed, shell companies, layered transactions, offshore banking, became standard practice in organized crime and are still used today by criminal organizations and corrupt elites worldwide. The idea that crime should be run like a business, that intelligence mattered more than violence, that systematic corruption was more valuable than brute force. That was pure Arnold Rothstein. Part 15. What I learned. I left the gambling world in 1938, 10 years after Arnold died. By then, I'd seen enough. I'd watched men get rich and die poor. I'd watched empires rise and collapse. I'd watched brilliance destroy itself. I moved to Los Angeles, changed my name, got a job in a warehouse, married a woman who knew nothing about my past, and tried to build a normal life. But I never forgot Arnold Rothstein. He was the smartest man I ever met. Not the most violent, not the most feared, not the most powerful in the traditional sense, but the smartest. He understood things other people didn't. He saw opportunities where others saw obstacles. He thought 5 steps ahead when everyone else was focused on the immediate problem. And yet, he died at 46, shot over a gambling debt, bleeding out on a hotel floor, taking his secrets to the grave. What does that tell you about genius? About intelligence? About the limits of being smarter than everyone else? I think it tells you that brilliance isn't enough. You can be the most intelligent person in the room, but if you can't control your weaknesses, if you can't resist your own compulsions, intelligence becomes a tool for self-destruction. Arnold Rothstein invented modern organized crime. He taught a generation of mobsters how to think strategically. He corrupted American politics, fixed the World Series, pioneered drug trafficking, and made millions through gambling and bootlegging. And he died broke, shot, and alone, refusing to say who killed him. That's the price of genius in the underworld. Epilogue. The man who fixed everything except himself. I'm 93 years old now. Most people from those days are long gone. The world has changed beyond recognition. The mob still exists, but it's a shadow of what it was. The techniques Arnold pioneered are still used, but the names have changed. Sometimes I think about that night in October 1919, when I first realized the World Series was fixed. The moment my innocence died. The moment I understood that money could buy anything, corrupt anything, fix anything. Arnold Rothstein proved that. He fixed sporting events, political races, criminal prosecutions. He fixed problems that seemed unfixable. He made the impossible possible. But he couldn't fix himself. He couldn't overcome his addiction to gambling. He couldn't avoid the bullet that killed him. He couldn't escape the consequences of refusing to pay a debt. That's the ultimate irony of Arnold Rothstein's life. The fixer couldn't fix his own fatal flaw. And maybe that's the real lesson. Not that intelligence conquers all. Not that being smart means you'll win. But that everyone, no matter how brilliant, no matter how powerful, has a weakness that will eventually destroy them. Arnold Rothstein's weakness was gambling. Mine was believing, for a while, that his world could be controlled. We were both wrong.